All right, I think we can go ahead. Um, I can use this time to actually talk about Kök Project and Agri-Food Connect, and we can also it could be because of repetition for our previous audience who actually joined to our sessions as well. So I will use this time to talk about that, and then we can dive into this session of the Agri-Food Connect for today. So first of all, before we kick off, Adam, thank you so much for joining us this early this morning. I was really looking forward to this session and looking forward to hearing your insights and your experience within the field of agri-food sector and your work within the CleanTech. So before we dive into that, I'm going to talk about really briefly about what is Kök Project and what we do through the Agri-Food Connect series. So as I mentioned, our organization name is Kök Projekt. In a traditional sense, we are an accelerator and a corporate innovation partner for the agriculture, food, and water sector. Our company, our headquarters are actually based in Istanbul, Turkey, but we're quite active within the MENA, FSU, APAC, and the Sub-Saharan African region. We work on developing acceleration programs and working on empowering the agri-food entrepreneurs through on a global network. We cover pretty much all the sections of agri-food value chain, from seed to the plate, from soil to the shelf. And we work with the entrepreneurs, help them grow and scale and reach their potential and beyond. So if you would like to know about our work and what we do and the other stuff that we do, you can log into our website, which is kökprojekt.com. In there, you can join to our newsletter where we share several different topics regarding the agri-food sector, from the corporate side, from the investment side, from the startup side. And also, you can check out our ecosystem maps and reports where we look into the agri-food innovation sector and follow up the developments and look into the startups who are working within those fields. Lastly, we have established a digital community where we call it the Kök community. In there, you can meet up with startups, corporate representatives, and also investors to get together and share your work within. It's a Slack community, and all you have to do is just log into our website and click in one click, you will be a member. So that being said, that comes to the topic of today. The Agri-Food Connect is the webinar series we kicked off almost 3-4 months ago now. And the idea was that since with the global pandemic, we are changing our habits on consumption, the food production, and also the whole agri-food value chain is being changed. Through those webinars, we collaborated with various stakeholders, and they've shared their knowledge, insight, and understanding regarding the changing perspectives of the agri-food sector, and also what is going to come next. So with these series, we started last month on the series of the US edition, and now today we have Adam Bergman with us. He is the managing director of EcoTech Capital and doing lots of work within this field of, as I mentioned, the clean tech and also the agri-food entrepreneurship, especially on the corporate side as well, which he will be sharing furthermore on that. So Adam, thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to pass the mic to you and started to hearing your insights and also your work further.
Well, thank you, Sami. Appreciate it. And let me just pull up my presentation so we can get this going. And appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today. Real interesting topic. So I'll just give you a quick overview on myself and what I do. So as Sami mentioned, I'm Adam Bergman, Managing Director of EcoTech Capital. I have to put my disclosures up, past that. So a lot of people ask what's EcoTech Capital do? So EcoTech Capital is a boutique investment bank, and I focus on raising capital and executing M&A transactions for companies, as well as providing advisory services and insight to senior execs and boards on growth strategies at the intersection of climate change and technology innovation. So it's a big area. I started working in this about 15 years ago. And really, a lot of people want to understand what's clean tech. It's a word we hear about. It was big from about 2005, 2010, and then things went wrong, and people started talking negatively about it. And a lot don't even want to mention the word clean tech anymore, as it would be. But for me, really, clean tech is how do you take technology innovation and bring it to trillion-dollar sectors of the economy that haven't had the same type of technological revolution that we've seen in other industries. And what they do is they create massive disruption and enable resource efficiency and sustainability. And it's real important that one understands the background here, because I often get questions of, well, how can you work in energy? How can you work in transportation? How can you work in utilities and then spend all this time in the food and ag sector? How are they similar? So I like to tell people there's really a lot of similarities, and I would argue my experience working in these other sectors, I did a lot of work in the energy side, renewable energy, from about 2004 to 2010. I did a lot of work in mobility from starting in about 2008. I did a lot of work in utilities, which was LED lights and energy efficiency back in about 2008 and 10. And really what you're talking about are industries that are real similar. They've been around for hundreds of years in many cases. They have large entrenched monopolists who run them. These parties have strong cash flow. They have large distribution. They have a brand name, and they're well known. And you have all these new companies trying to break in. And really, there's a lot of similarities in all these end markets. And what's important to remember is we might put the word tech here for the companies that are playing, so all these ag tech and food tech companies, but the reality is they're not going into the internet. They are not going in to compete to like Facebook did or Google did 15 years ago. They're going into end markets that already exist. And I think it's really important to understand that, because you're going to face existing players who have no interest in giving up their monopoly and strength. And that's something that all these companies need to understand. And I often say partnering is a good way. So the question often comes up, what do I cover in ag and food tech? And really, there's often a lot of questions around what this sector really corresponds to. And I think, as I mentioned before, we're talking about sectors where you can bring technology and people can profit by integrating it to exploit the inefficiencies throughout the food and ag value chain. We'll talk a bit more about this after, but I think all of us would agree, if nothing else, COVID-19 has really made these issues even bigger than they were before, about the challenges in the food and ag value chain, the supply chain's not working. So when I look at the sector, really what comes to mind for me is, first, there's the world of ag biotech, which is anything in the soil, which crop nutrition, seed technology, microbiomes, and within seed it includes CRISPR. Animal ag tech, what's happening with animals to improve efficiency, yield, at the same time improve animal health, make it so that there's less issues for animal welfare, less waste, less inefficiency. Automation and robotics, another very big area. For those who don't live in California like I do, this is an incredibly important issue, because we're talking about a region that has dealing with three huge issues right now. One, they raised minimum wage, which made labor really expensive in a lot of the farming communities. Two, the US doesn't have a very efficient immigration policy at the moment, which leads to tremendous uncertainty. So people are unsure what actually is going to happen in terms of having people come and pick. And then the third one, which is interesting, and it's probably not a US phenomenon, but it's probably happened in other places around the world. The growers I speak to tell me that even in families that have been picked for generations, millennial children don't want to do the job. Let's be honest. Picking fruits and vegetable is not easy. It's hard labor. You're out in the sun. So they're struggling with those people would rather take a lower paid job at fast food or a Walmart. So automation and robotics is one that I think is accelerating the speed. Digital ag, anything from drones and satellites in the sky to sensors on the ground, and then data. And I would argue right now, there's been tremendous amount of capital invested into digital precision ag. But I would argue in most areas, it's a real big challenge because we have all that data and people are still struggling to come up with business models that are effective for growers to show how the grower is going to profit and use it effectively to make more money. Supply chain technologies with continuing issues with any type of foodborne illness or outbreaks, the need for safety and traceability is really important. Interestingly, if we had had this conversation 12, 18 months ago, we'd be yelling about the word blockchain. But I would argue blockchain has kind of fallen out of fashion a little recently with COVID-19. I think it'll come back, but it's just not one of the topics. Additionally, there's other areas that I would argue, this is what we've talked about a lot now, is I would argue is a lot more of the ag tech. We move more into what I'd say more on the food tech side. Waste mitigation. If you want to talk about a problem that's accelerated with COVID-19, waste mitigation is, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But shelf life extension is really a huge issue and an enormous opportunity. And then the ones traditionally where I think a lot of people talk about food tech, which is indoor farming. Huge growth. There was a big announcement in the US yesterday about Plenty with an agreement with Albertsons, which is a large supermarket chain, and then alternative protein. And I like to tell people, outside of, say, biotech focused on COVID-19, I don't think there's a more active investment area than alternative protein. It's really active at this point. So as we move in, I think people want to know what's really happening. What are the key trends here? So for me, when I look at the sector, there were 5 things that jumped out at me. One, consumers are in charge. Let's be clear. The world has changed. Some of it's the internet. Some of it's how people are rethinking things from COVID-19. But generally, I find today consumers are looking for fresher, healthier, more sustainable, and tastier food options. Industrial farming that started in the 70s was really good at putting together tremendous amount of food and making sure that the world would not go hungry to most degrees. That being said, the food they often created was not the most nutritious and was not the tastiest. And because of that, I would argue we don't have the greatest tasting food today. And I think there's a backlash against industrial ag. I like to argue if you go into the supermarket and you go, at least in the US, in the middle of it, you probably can name the brands of all the unhealthy food you eat. You probably know them all because that's what CPG does. Most protein, fruits and vegetables, at least in the US, aren't branded. And I think you're going to see over time, one of the phenomena that I find fascinating is what Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat have been able to do in branding their product. If you went into a US supermarket today, even today, the ground beef is not branded. Despite the fact the largest 2 producers are Tyson and Cargill, they still don't brand it, which for Tyson's particularly interesting because they brand all their chicken. Another area is fresh rather than processed. So on this point, when we talk about it, consumers are looking for stuff that's fresher, that's healthier, and they're looking for more fruits and vegetables and healthier protein rather than traditional row crops and grains and cereals where there's a lot of sugar. And that's something I think that's going to either accelerate further. The ag sector is doing a good job initially starting to implement a lot of this technology. And there's a lot of technology out there. The challenge is, as a grower, you work in 40-year cycles typically. As a grower, you're going to have 40 seasons in your life to be successful. So one of those seasons, if it goes wrong, you could put yourself in a position where your business could fail. So it's really important when the growers are using technology that this technology works, that it's not going to have issues, and it's not going to lead to a grower using something that creates an issue such that they can't produce enough and go bankrupt. Health and nutrition is a mega trend. I like to tell people what really surprised me, and again, I came to food and ag from a tech and a sustainability background, not a food and ag background. But what really surprised me is, for some reason, we've got to a point where the stuff we eat all the time is food and ag, but there's another area that's emerged called health and nutrition, which is medicine and supplements and vitamins, and it's the biotech and pharma area. And I don't get it. It makes no sense to me why the stuff we don't put in our body is also health and nutrition. Realistically, back to my earlier point, if we could change how people eat and we significantly cut down on the bad foods that they eat, we could be at a point, if at least in the US, someone calculated, if we got to the point where Americans ate healthier and we reduced obesity, we could eliminate 40% of our healthcare costs. So that's a tremendous opportunity through health and nutrition. And then last one is one that I speaks to me again from my lessons of CleanTech, which is China's going to win. So if you look at some of the sectors that the Chinese have come into, whether it's renewable energy, LED lights, or EVs, we've seen the Chinese come in, whether through an industrial policy or just because they took a lot of this technology and were able to make it cheaper, have become a global leader. And I think anyone who understands China would tell you that the Chinese have a strategic imperative around food. Let's be honest, the Chinese government understands that Chinese governments historically have fallen due to food riots or some sort of food issue, and they want to make sure that's not going to happen. The Chinese have bought a lot of land in Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, and are going to be very focused on ensuring that their people have enough to eat, even as the Chinese diet changes over time and there's a lot more protein and other foods that are eaten in middle income and higher income countries. So one of the things that I like to say is, if you look at what's happening in the world, a lot of the innovation's coming because ag's commoditized. So there's the farmer themselves are struggling to make a lot of money, as are some of the large ag groups, ADM, Bunge, Cargill. So everyone's thinking about how do we bring technology in to drive more innovation. As I talked before, labor continues to be a huge issue, and I'd argue a lot of it's been exacerbated today by social distancing. It's really tough to pick in a field 6 feet away when your rows aren't 6 feet away. And so you start talking about, okay, what are the options? Well, clearly automation is a huge option, and we're seeing more of it. I talked a little bit more about safety and traceability. There seems to be a growing number of foodborne illness outbreaks in the US, whether it's our leafy greens or our meat. I think both of those areas, because of those issues, it's one of the reasons I believe we're going to see more indoor farming, at least around the produce sector. Sustainability is an area that is growing in importance to many, both consumers and because of that, CPG and retailers. One of the things I tell people is, I remember about 12 or 13 years ago, Walmart came out and said, look, the supply chain is driving too much carbon, that we need to cut emissions. And they more or less went back to their suppliers and said, you need to cut your emissions by, I don't remember if it was 20% or something of that nature within the next 5 years. We're not going to pay you any more for it, but if you don't do it, we will find other suppliers who will. And I think you're seeing that already with the Walmarts and Amazons and big food retailers telling people we need to figure out ways to cut greenhouse gases, to cut chemicals on the farm. Another thing is digital ag. I talked about digital and precision ag before, but one of the things I like to tell people is what's really important is, how do you use this data? Because right now, I would argue one of the biggest problems or limitations out there is the farmer doesn't know how to effectively use this data to make money. That being said, the person who does know how to use this data to make money are banks. Banks, insurance companies deal with risk mitigation all the time, and for them, there are ways to use this. So I like to say, to use precision ag most effectively, we need to show that it works and someone can make money. So I'm really optimistic, as more financial institutions use precision ag, we're going to be in a position to drive it into the farm, because the farmer and others are now going to have seen it works and people can make money, and it's going to make them money. So the last couple points I think are really important, which is, unlike some of the other industries that I've worked in over time, the large corporates are very active. When you look at the big three, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, either have VC arms or external innovation teams. Bayer does, Syngenta does, and now food has got more involved, whether it's Kellogg's or Kraft Heinz or Tyson. You're seeing the emergence all of these players are having, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, because they understand that innovation is coming to the sector and they don't want to miss it. I like I'll tell that in a second. And then the last thing is, at least in the US, we're seeing a lot of either co-ops or marketing associations. Land O'Lakes, who's big in the Midwest for row crops and dairy, and Western Growers, who's in California doing a lot of specialty and permanent crops, are very active. As it happens, I'm speaking to the Western Growers Innovation Center next week. So what do I mean by what's happening here with Big Ag? Well, one of the things that's been very interesting is in other sectors I've covered over time, what's occurred is food and the traditional incumbents have often been dismissive of a lot of these new players and haven't been willing to adopt the technology. I saw it initially in the energy sector. Neither energy companies or industrial companies were really behind the first wave of renewable energy. But over time, you've seen each of the incumbents in the sectors, whether it was the utilities or the large car companies, get more behind the growth and understanding that this is happening, whether they're involved or not. And if they're not involved, they can be disintermediated from their supply chain and be in a position where they go out of business. And to that point, one of the things that I found interesting is I was at a dinner with some people from Bunge and Cargill, and when we started talking about ag and food tech and the strategics, they said to me, look, we saw what happened with the big three automakers and how they failed to pursue electrification. And because of that, they were put in a position where they were behind people like Tesla and others. And long term, it could lead to their downfall. They might actually end up going bankrupt because they're not producing the right car. And their comment was, that's not going to happen to us. Whether we believe that all these trends are real or not, we are either going to invest into the companies or we're going to develop it ourselves, because we're not going to be blindsided by technology innovation. And so for me, as I looked at the sector, one of the things that I realized from my earlier work around renewable energy and electric vehicles and utility technologies was you have people in the sector who have very diverse backgrounds. They could be coming from energy, they could be coming from tech, utilities, industrial, and they don't know each other. And it's really difficult to bring collaboration together, which is needed when people don't know each other. So for me, one of the things I focused on is kind of being in the middle of this triangle, clearly spending lots of time with the food and ag tech companies, a lot of time with the large established food and ag players, but also with the investors. And the investors are really important to the sector. And as an example, if you look at what's happened since 2003, we've had tremendous growth in the amount of investment that's happening. You look back in $1.5 billion back in 2013, growing to $7.6 billion in 2019. And despite COVID, it wouldn't surprise me if we're on track for a similar amount in 2020 and maybe even potentially even more. I'll get into some of the capital side later, but really what I think is very interesting is the investment community. And again, there's different type of investors here. There's a lot of pure food and ag tech investors. We're seeing a lot of family office, sovereign wealth funds, university endowments, some of the later stage PEs coming in, some crossover investors. We're even in the food tech side more than ag tech, we're seeing the generalist Sand Hill Road investors. So there's a myriad of growing investors out there, and what they see is tremendous disruptions happening in the food and ag sector, and they want to be a part of it. So to me, I think a good question is, what does that mean, and what's happening in the sector? So as I said before, from where I sit, the food and ag tech sector is doing really well. It's continuing to get lots of investment. There's a lot of interest. I talk to new investors all the time looking at the sector. One question I do have, though, is a two-tier system emerging in terms of how investors are thinking about this and how companies are able to raise capital, where you're seeing a small group of later stage companies who are well known going out to raise big rounds. So in the past 5-6 months, Appeal Sciences, Farmers Business Network, Impossible Foods, Indigo Ag, all raised $250 million at over $1 billion valuation. That being said, the smaller companies in the sector, I think a lot of them I'm talking to are struggling to raise capital, and they're raising less money than the big guys, but they're still struggling to figure out how they raise this capital to fund their growth when a lot of investors are concerned about the implications of COVID-19 and what these technologies are really have as a roadmap to profitability. So in addition to what's happening on that end, the other thing that I think is really interesting is, as I mentioned before, there have been a lot of major issues that have emerged in the food and ag supply chain, and it's leading to a lot of issues with food waste and rising prices. I was surprised recently when I went to the supermarket and was looking at prices and thought pretty much everything I bought is more expensive. And the other thing that's interesting is a lot of stuff that used to periodically go on sale is not at this point. So I think food and ag companies on one hand see some rising prices, and on the other hand, they see a very captive market today, because it's not like we're going out to restaurants, so we're buying all our stuff either at supermarkets, online, or going to the supermarket. And what's happening because of this? Well, farmers have been really badly hit. We're in a situation where before COVID-19 in the US, 55% of food went into food service. That's restaurants, hotels, universities, schools, stadiums. That market's dropped in some places 60 to 70%, in other places even more. And that's a major problem. Not because the food isn't coming through the other side, which is there's a huge uptick in food consumed from grocery stores or bought online, and sadly from food banks. But the problem is how you package the food in the US for food service is in much larger portions, and it doesn't actually have all the food labeling on it that you do when you sell to a consumer. So you can't just repackage this and send it off to the shop, to the retail side, to grocery stores. So you've seen a lot of food waste. You've also seen outbreaks in the meat processing facilities, which are a major issue in the US. I know Germany's had a similar problem. And when you talk to people, you ask about automation, and they say theoretically you can do it, but cutting meat is actually somewhat of a precision job that you need a human being to do. So there's a lot of issues they're going to need to do. I also mentioned before social distancing and shelter in place. What are we seeing? Well, there's a couple trends that I think are pretty interesting, particularly in food tech. One, alternative protein consumption is going up. Now, whether it's going up because in the US there's more in stores than there was before, or because people are freaked out because these outbreaks are happening at meat processing facilities, and either there's less meat available, the meat prices have gone up, or people are concerned that if there's COVID-19 in a meat processing plant, could there be COVID-19 in their meat? Whatever the reason is, alternative protein consumption is rising. Personally, I believe that's going to continue. One of the things we'll probably touch on later, but when I look at meat consumption, alternative meat consumption, I look at where dairy, non-dairy alternatives are today as a roadmap, and that's really important. Centralized production has failed. I like to tell the story of, at one point early in the outbreak, I walked into my local supermarket and it was out of produce. And I kind of sat there shaking my head. I live 90 miles from Salinas in the Central Valley of California, where everything's grown. So I called up my friend who leads Western Growers Innovation Center and is also a farmer, and I said to him, "You guys having trouble? Are we like lacking food? Do I need to like go to another place and like start hoarding food?" And he literally said to me, "I have no clue what you're talking about." He's like, "Let me make a couple calls," and he called 4 people, got back to me. He said, "No, we have too much." And I said, "Okay, I'm confused." And we later found out that there was a COVID-19 outbreak at a distribution center, and because of that, they weren't able to get, this large supermarket couldn't get produce into my area, and that's a problem. And so I like to tell people, I think indoor farming has a huge opportunity. While I know that people get concerned and say, well, there could be an outbreak in an indoor farm. Well, I could tell you a lot of the indoor farms I go today are almost purely autonomous. I've been to a couple where I've seen them have 2 people. That's it. literally they have one person who's in charge of kind of maintenance and one person who's making sure everything on the technology is working. And so I think automation is clearly going to drive a lot of that, but I'm a big believer in indoor farming. A lot of it, and I'm sure we'll talk about it after, is on my earlier comments about taste and freshness. Last thing is, and this is a phenomenon that's coming out recently, and it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out in food and ag tech. And some of the other clean tech areas, well, first of all, we're seeing a general huge valuation difference between public markets and private markets. If anyone's watched what Tesla has done on really no significant news up increasing its production, it's up, I think, 300-something% this year. And you've seen a number of private EV companies have gone public. But interestingly, not with traditional IPOs. They've either done a SPAC, which is a special purpose acquisition corporation, which is a company that raises money in the public markets and then buys a private company, or what they call a non-traditional listing, which is often a private company merges with a public company that's just a shell. There's not really any assets to it, and then that becomes the public entity. I'm interested to see, will you see that as well in food and ag tech? And one of the reasons to do it is because it's much quicker than a traditional IPO. And there's a lot of investors out there who are really excited by this area. I'd also say to those who are out there looking and thinking about raising capital, this is not the first economic downturn. I actually heard someone last week say, look, we've experienced these things before, even if it was 100 years ago. We haven't come up with a new word for COVID-19. It's a pandemic. We've had it before, and we've all experienced it, and we know how things are going to occur. But there are lessons, and that's important. It's not just from pandemics, but from other economic challenging times. So the first one is raising capital is going to take longer for most companies. We're in a time when investors can't meet you in person. Investors can't go and do on-site due diligence. Because of that, it's likely going to take longer. Also, there's likely an impact on valuation for many companies. Again, not all companies. We've seen some deals with some very high valuations recently, but a lot of companies are going to hit by valuation. And a lot of that reason is there's a number of investors who have decided they're not looking to invest at this specific time. They're taking a little slowdown. And because of that, there's less capital around. Now, the positive to all of that is I've talked to hundreds of investors, and when I talk to any who say, you know what, we're just going to sit on the sideline for 6, 12, 18 months till this passes, my response is often, oh, so I expect you're going to return the money to your investors, your LPs, and I get very quizzical looks like, of course we're not going to do that. So my takeaway from all that is there's going to be the same amount of money available. It just might not be available today. It just might be a little bit more in the future. And as it comes back in, hopefully it will get the sector and valuations back to where they were, assuming that was the right value at the time. Investors are looking for more capital in efficient business models. One of the things I like to say is if the WeWorks, Ubers, and Lyfts went to market today, private market, they'd struggle because investors would say, so you're going to raise billions of dollars, and after raising billions of dollars, you're then going to have the opportunity to potentially make money? Yeah, that's not a good business model. So I think people, you don't need to make money today, but you need to really have a path to make money and be profitable. And I like to say that this is a time when using your money most effectively is important, and you can even do it at the expense of top line growth. So people, what I find today, are often wondering, well, you're growing really well, but you're also burning a lot of capital. Are you actually pricing your product properly? Or like Tesla has done for many years, are you giving thousands of dollars to the customer with your car because your car costs more than they're actually paying for it? And that's something important to think about. The other area that I think is really important is strategic partners. It's important when I look out there to think, as someone who raises capital, that these companies have other large established players who think they're valuable. And I don't mean that they need someone who is going to invest or partner with them who's going to acquire them. They could also be customers, distributors, suppliers. But it's really important in tough economic times when you're trying to go out to financial investors who might not know the sector that well or as well as others, that they realize strategics are there. Also, keep in mind that if you look at my experience in the tech sector, whether I started out doing healthcare internet, then I was at regular internet, and then 15 years of high growth clean tech, almost all the exits here are going to be M&A. There are very few of them that are going to be IPOs. You probably maybe get 10% IPOs, but most of them are going to be M&A. So you need to know who's going to buy you. And as a capital raiser, I think it's important to know that, because it makes it much easier to raise capital if others think, okay, we think there's an exit because there's these people who could buy them. The other thing I'd say, and I've seen this in other parts of clean tech as well, is it's really important to have an opportunity to have a platform. There's a lot of companies that make a product. The problem with the product is it's really expensive to go to market and to get customers. And when you have those customers, if you can only sell one thing, you probably aren't monetizing it very well. So the last thing I'd say about the sector is, I've talked about all the negatives. Let's talk about some positives. Well, building a food and ag tech company in a challenging time gives people an opportunity to really scale and grow it. If you look at, I think Microsoft, Apple, and Google were all formed during recessions. I'm not trying to say every company succeeds in a recession, but if you can, I guess it's the old adage from New York City where they said, if you could make it there, you can make it anywhere. Well, if you can survive during a global pandemic and build a business, and know what, when the world gets good, you're going to be in a lot better shape to scale and grow that business. Second, food's an essential good. It's not going away. There's sectors that I've seen that are going to go away or go through really difficult times. Food is not one of them. And more importantly, it's an area that you're finding producers, consumers, and politicians focused on. It was interesting. The one time Donald Trump really jumped in was when there was a shortage of meat. And what did he do? He made sure that the meat processing facilities stayed open, because he did not like to hear that people were going into fast food restaurants and they couldn't get hamburgers. And I think that's really important for the sector to say politicians are going to step in and make sure that this is working properly. And then the last thing is ag tech and food tech are part of the clean tech megatrend, and this is generating tremendous investor interest. A challenge is a lot of this interest typically looks at public companies, and most of the companies in the sector are private, but my hope is there'll be over time a way to get some of this private money into some of the public money to private investors. So the last thing I want to cover is the M&A market. And one of the things I like to say to people is this is an early stage sector. Yes, there's been M&A. When I got in 5 years ago, people talked about the fact that Monsanto bought Climate Corp for $1 billion. The problem is there hasn't been a series of similar transactions over a long period of time. A few years ago, in the space of probably 1 week, we saw DuPont Pioneer acquired Granular, and Deere acquired Blue River for $300 million, and it was 50 times, 100 times current revenue. It was a huge multiple. It wasn't based on revenue. It was based on what each of those businesses thought could happen. What I think is important and really interesting is I started getting calls from my clients saying, look at these deals, everything's selling for 50 times revenue, let's go sell ourselves. And I said, wait a second, hold on. I understand. I would usually have said, look, one deal doesn't make a market, but in this case, I said 2 deals doesn't make a market. If over the next 6 months, we see similar transactions happening where strategics are paying 50 times revenue, I agree with you. We'll get ready to go. We'll sell you. I'll be very excited to do that. Reality is there hasn't been another deal like that in the last 3 years. And most of the deals have been smaller and at lower valuations. In this case, DuPont Pioneer and Deere had major reasons for those acquisitions. So what's the market like today? So I would say a couple things. One, it's definitely a more of a buyer's market than a seller's market. We're seeing a lot of strategics coming in to see, are there assets that are valuable, but maybe aren't standalone companies who are struggling to raise capital. So that's one of the things that a lot of the acquisitions I think are going to come at fire sale prices after companies can't raise money. Two, I think that you're also going to see a lot of strategics thinking about how do they use these acquisitions to drive their business into new areas? And I actually think you're going to see a lot of private companies making acquisitions as well, and a lot of private sellers wanting to sell to other private companies where they think there's more of an upside and it's a better cultural fit than selling to large strategics. So I like to say to my private companies, you should think about who are the 5 or 10 companies you'd like to acquire, and just be monitoring what's happening, or have an outreach and conversation to see what's going on. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities, but we're still early stage in the M&A side. And with that, I'll turn back to Semi with, I like to keep on my favorite slide of what's happening here. So of what's happening in protein, because I find it one of the more interesting areas.
This is an awesome slide. I mean, I think this is one of my favorites in that presentation. Adam, thank you so much. I mean, this was a full plate presentation, if I may. Thank you so much for sharing all of this data. And it's really exciting to know that how the shift is actually happening in US. And you touch base with, as you mentioned, on the corporate side, you mentioned the local organizations as such, cooperatives, and basically the ecosystem that is focusing on how it's possible to actually raise capital during a global pandemic. So I want to actually dive in with that. I want to kick off with that. I actually, one of the terms that you mentioned as the doing due diligence, in this period, it's not actually possible that you do it before. So you need to, take into account of, meeting with the investors by Zoom, online, and basically just relying yourself to sell your startup via email or DocSend. So how would you, what would be your recommendations for startups on this, period, to how they should, develop their strategies to raise capital, since all of these situations are happening? It's also changing the course of agri-food sector.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I like to tell my clients, and this is advice I'm giving to them real time, is the most important thing you can do right now is focus on your business. COVID-19 has been a hit to all industries. Again, I think very few companies are going to actually hit the projections for 2020 that they were initially assuming because of all the challenges out there. And if you focus on your business and you're able to execute, that's actually going to be one of the more valuable things to resonate with investors. If you say, look, we said we were going to do X and we've been able to do that, I think people are going to say, wow, that's impressive in COVID-19. And if you haven't been able to, you need to give an explanation as to why this business is going to do better in 2021, because one could make an argument that the first half of 2021, even in the best case scenarios, might not be any better than now until the world has a vaccine. So I think to me, it comes to performance. Now, if you want to reach out and you want to talk to them, yeah, there's Zoom, clearly you're doing it. I've heard there's a couple companies that are now putting together and doing due diligence videos, like if it was taking the investor into the facility, and you'll see more of that type of technology innovation. But I go back to nuts and bolts, which is the sector you're in is actually doing decently. A number of the larger companies have actually outperformed their projections. So you need to have a story, and if you're doing well, that's going to be a great way to articulate why you're well positioned and why they should invest. And if you're not doing well, you better come up with a reason for that and how things are going to change going forward, because that's, as an investor, that's what people want to know. There's always things that happen that are unexpected. I would agree that a global pandemic was probably not on anyone's list, but I think most people you talk to would have said there's going to be an economic recession at some point because the economy's been growing so quickly. So I just think it comes down to me, performance and vision. What are you doing? How do you fit in the future? Because we've had tremendous changes and we don't know how much of them are going to stay. I would assume that food service 5 years from now is probably not going to be 55% of all sales in the US. It's probably going to be less. It could be 45%, And that's assuming that people go back mostly to their old lives. And if they don't fully go back to it, it could be even less. So restaurants as a whole might be 1/3 as many in the future. And what's the play? The play's ghost kitchens and being set up with those places that are going to be doing delivery. So I think one needs to be, the food and ag chain failed to be quickly responsive to the shift from food service to retail, and companies that understand things shift and are able to move quickly, and that's typically what a good startup can do, are the ones that are successful.
Absolutely, and that actually brings my another question. I wanted to actually continue that topic. Is there any of the examples you would like to give on the topic of startups who have seen quite a good success with the pandemic, or any of their shift and adjusting? Is there anyone that you would like to mention?
Well, I would say this. I would talk more broadly on shift. So I like to give an example. There's a company called Appeal Sciences who went out to market, and they found that their technology worked, but the processors who used it said, look, if we use your technology, it costs us money. And if it costs us money and retail's not going to pay more for it, then it's not a good investment, even if it works well. And these guys were putting on a coating onto avocados. And so Appeal went around and went to Costco and said, you really should be using our technology. Here's why, and explained to them and showed them, and then showed people who buy avocados actually spend more at the grocery store. And with that, the grocery store realized, wait a second, we have an opportunity to provide a better product to our consumers. Everyone who eats avocados know when you buy them, the shelf life's really short, and when you open them, they pretty much have an hour till they turn brown at best, maybe 2. But it's not a great thing. So Appeal's technology extended that. And so they realized that they needed to go into a non-traditional way to get to market. And I think you're seeing other people looking at that. I think of Impossible Foods. Impossible Foods said, I don't know if the average consumer is going to buy a beef alternative protein patty and take it home and cook it. So we're going to go to the best chefs in America who know how to cook things, and we're going to have them start making it. And when the consumer tastes it from an award-winning chef, they're going to say, you know what, this is great, and be much more willing to take it home and do that. So I would look at how companies adjust and how companies go to market as being two really important things. There's no doubt there's examples in COVID-19 that the challenges were really early still in that process, and I'm not sure. We'll see how many of them stick long term. But there's a lot of changes, and again, indoor farming, alternative protein being two areas that are driving that innovation, let alone ghost kitchens and delivery as well.
Absolutely. So one of my questions that is one of the classical questions I ask within our sessions, which you also touch base with, the indoor farming.
Yep.
So one of the issues that we've seen with the pandemic is that the producers were not able to actually go to the field and collect and harvest the produce due to the COVID potential of contracting the virus, and also contracting via the food, which is proved that is not actually happening. But still, there was a fear and misconception on that topic, which actually affected the whole agriculture value chain. That also brings the question of, as you mentioned, the rise of the indoor farming with requiring less people actually involved in the process.
Yeah.
So if you would bet, let's say, where you would put your money on the indoor farming or on the open field smart agriculture technologies, which one you see more future in?
So I'll bring this up because it kind of has the novel farming stuff in it.
Okay.
So first of all, I'm never betting against outdoor growing. We've been doing it for 5,000 years, and yes, we've come a long way, but there's more to do, because CRISPR technology, I think, could make a difference. I am a big believer in novel indoor farming for a couple reasons. I talked before, and I like to tell the story. I went to visit Plenty, which is an indoor farm here, probably 5 years ago.
Mhm.
And I said to the CEO, look, I understand why indoor farming's growing in the East Coast of the US and the Midwest of the US and the Southeast, because they're really far away from where food is grown in the US, our produce, which is California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Mexico. And he said to me, come on in and try this. And I tried it, and it was the best tasting kale, leafy greens, spring onions I had tasted. And I said to him, what's your technology? And he said to me, it's not technology. We're growing food for taste, not logistics. And I kind of stood there, and he looked at, and he said, okay, you're not getting it. Let me help you. Why does the world have iceberg lettuce? And I said, I don't know. It's literally a green wrap around water. He said, you're right. But it has it because 120 years ago, Salinas realized if they took iceberg lettuce, they could pack it in ice and send it to New York, and it would still be fine. And that's the reason we have a lot of this, that it's for logistics, not taste. And one of the things he also mentioned is, if you think about the fruits and vegetables, theoretically, it should be better in San Francisco than New York because I'm a couple hours drive and they're days on a train. And he said, but what happens is often the best produce gets sent to the east and the Midwest, and the worst to the closer regions, because they realize that the best produce has to survive. And so really what happens in the end is everyone gets a lesser quality produce. And so when I heard that, it resonated with me, and I said, I get it. You don't need to tell me anymore. It makes sense. And to me, the only questions that I really focus on now are cost, and can they get their cost structure down? Because I do believe for leafy greens, for tomatoes, which already was big, peppers, and some other products, it's a no-brainer. We're going to see a lot of it going indoors. The question's going to be, can they get the technology working to expand effectively into berries, into other high-value fruits and vegetables? And a lot of that's still to be shown. We're not there yet. There's been billions of dollars invested to date, whether it's been in greenhouses, where I give a shout out because Gotham has done a great job of opening a lot of facilities recently. I think they've done about 4 in the last 6 months. And then you've seen they make money. There's a couple others that make money. And then you have all the vertical farming guys who are only using LED lights that have raised a lot of capital and are building really interesting businesses. But you wonder, can they get their cost structure to a place where they're building their own technology and their own software, and the economics will still make sense? The other thing I really like about indoor farming is it's grown without chemicals and pesticides. And I think there's an opportunity in the future to really label this stuff, as I like to tell people, as post-organic, because to the shock of most people, organics actually have pesticides and chemicals in it. Most people don't realize it. They're just government agreed to chemicals and pesticides, so that are supposed to not be bad. But I think most consumers would still rather grow indoors without having to use chemicals and pesticides. So I'm really bullish on this trend. Where my biggest concerns are is, what is the long-term product category? How broad can they grow? We know they're never going to be growing grains. You're not going to be growing corn, wheat, soybean, cotton indoors. It's just not going to make sense. There might be specialty varieties that you'd grow because they could get such a premium.
Right.
But outside of leafy greens, tomatoes, how broad can we go? And to me, the broader they can go and the lower they can get the cost structure, which to me is using off-the-shelf equipment, is using autonomy and robotics, and is using CRISPR technology. Because one of the things I tell people is really important is, we've been growing outdoor for 5,000 years. We've optimized a lot of this. Now, climate change could make outdoor growing optimization need to change, but we've optimized a lot of the growing. Indoor, we've never grown under LED lights. We have no clue if you are able to generate seeds that could provide significantly better tasting fruit and vegetable, can improve yields, can improve quality, and all these other things. I think that's really interesting to see where that goes.
Right. Absolutely. So my last question, it's also one of the classics, but you mentioned a lot of, the trends and also the topics and also the startups. But to sum up, what are the three main topics that you would suggest that you find it, quite interesting or quite, need the attention that we should look into, quite important? It could be defined by your own terms, of course, but what is the main three topics within these, agri-food sector that you would suggest that people should definitely look into?
Sure. I'm gonna go back to this slide. I'm sorry. This where the trends are.
Right.
I think if you follow particularly one that consumers are in charge, we're looking for better tasting food, healthier, fresher, and I think that really is points 1 and 2 together. Consumers are in charge and they want fresher, healthier, tastier food and less processed food. I think that's one.
Right.
2, there is lots of innovation. I did a conversation last week with Michael Swanson, who's Wells Fargo's chief ag economist. And one of the things he really pointed out that I think is really important, people don't often make technology for ag. Mm-hmm. Ag takes technology from other industries and uses it and adapts it the way it needs to use it. So let's be very clear. There's not a group focused. AI wasn't invented for ag. Blockchain wasn't invented for ag. CRISPR data analytics, fintech. None of this was developed for ag specifically, but ag is taking these technologies and figuring out ways to effectively use it. But let's also keep in mind the ag side is slow moving. Food is much faster. One of the challenges with ag is it's B2B, and we know businesses are slow moving. Food is B2C, and that's why we've seen a rapid increase in alternative protein. We've seen opportunity in indoor farming to grow quickly, some of the shelf life extension, because it's getting to consumers. A lot of the technologies that go on the farm are just going to take longer to get adopted. And then the third one, I think really what we're seeing is large strategics want to play here. They're going to play here. And in the end, I think companies that figure out how to partner and work most effectively with strategics are going to be the winners. And often, if you decide you're going to take the strategics on, I think in many regards, you're going to struggle. And that's, by the way, something that's not new. If you think about food brands, whether it's Ben & Jerry's or Kraft or Annie's or others, they get acquired because they reach a certain size, and often what's happened is they run onto a wall. And what that wall is shelf space from the large CPG players. And the large CPG players, interestingly, have made many acquisitions over time and don't announce them. I have a friend who is over at General Mills leading sustainability, and we were talking, and I said to him, one of the things I found most interesting was the day I found the box tops for education on the Annie's box, because I'm only used to seeing them on Cheerios. And I said, I think General Mills bought Annie's. And I looked it up and they had, and I said, it was interesting. They didn't make an announcement. And I'm sure most of Annie's consumers would have been pretty unhappy to hear that General Mills had bought them because they wouldn't want to be acquired by a big company. But that's, the reality is, you're not, General Mills, Nestle, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Bayer, Syngenta, Corteva aren't going away. And the question is going to be, how do the new technology players work with them or in a means to get into a market that they're not specifically in? Because it's going to be very difficult to displace incumbents, is what I've seen over the years. Even Tesla, who's done fantastically well, is selling 500,000 cars in the US, and everyone else is selling 17 million. So they've got a tiny piece of the market. So that's the thing I think to lead is, strategics are there, they're not going away, but you can use them as a partner to effectively scale your business.
Excellent, perfect. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. So as last words, is there anything you would like to mention as, how people can actually follow up with EcoTech Capital, how they can reach you if they wanted to reach out to you? And also, is there anything you would like to mention regarding the works of EcoTech Capital as, you mentioned? So please go ahead.
Sure. I would say anyone who wants to get me, You can reach me at adam@ecotechcap.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. And I just tell people I look to work with really interesting companies that are focused at the intersection of tech innovation and climate change. And if I go back to the slide, that's to me where it is. And ag tech is the hottest piece of the clean tech climate change world. And I get really excited as someone, as you and I spoke before, I've been working in this area only 6 years. I'm not the person who came with 50 years of ag industry knowledge, but I understand trends and I see what's happening here, and it's very similar to what's happened in some of the other sectors a decade ago. And I think everyone in this area should be very optimistic because there's a huge amount of opportunity out there for growing and scaling. And for me, I just see a whole generation of new companies developing that are going to drive additional innovation, and what we eat and where it comes from is going to change in the next decade or two in many areas. And I think that's really exciting.
100%. I mean, I cannot say anything else, I guess, on that. Like, absolutely, I definitely agree. Thank you so much for sharing all of this data and great information. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insight on this session. So for people joining us today, thank you so much for joining. As I mentioned on the previous, beginning of the session, you can reach out to Kök Projekt on kökprojekt.com, find out about all the stuff that we do regarding the reports and ecosystem maps and the acceleration programs, but it's also in this session and also the sessions before, you can find them on our YouTube channel. All you have to do is just go to YouTube and type in Kök Projekt, and you will find the other sessions of the Agri-Food Connect. So thank you so much for joining in. Adam, thank you so much for joining in, this morning, very early time. So thank you so much for sharing all this great information, and, looking forward to see you next time. So thank you.
Good. Well, I appreciate the invitation and look forward to working more in the future. Great day.
Have a nice one. Great day. Take care.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.